The file begins. Anatomy of a digital tomb. In early 2026, 3 million documents detonate in the public square. Ghosts from Jeffrey Epstein's server, now given form and voice. And among them, the specter of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, frozen in a rictus grin. The photograph is the centerpiece, barefoot, on all fours. His hands hover over an unidentified woman on the floor. It is not a crime scene. It is something worse. A portrait of grotesque intimacy stripped of context and dignity. The emails provide the soundtrack. After the infamous photo with Virginia Giuffre surfaced, he allegedly writes to Epstein, a man he claimed to have cut off. The words glow on the screen like a toxic confession. Pause, we are in this together. The public reaction is not outrage. It is a cold, quiet revulsion. The dread around him is no longer a whisper. It is a physical presence, a shadow clinging to the walls of his gilded cage. The crown cannot afford to bleed. The verdict from King Charles III was delivered not with familial sorrow, but with the cold precision of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. The titles were not revoked. They were excised, a clinical procedure to save the monarchy's body from the poison of one man's past. The press release was the official death certificate of his public life. The man once known as H.R.H., the Duke of York KG, became a footnote, a ghost in the royal archives. His eviction from the 30-room royal lodge was the physical manifestation of this exile. The removal vans arriving in the Windsor mist were not just carrying furniture. They were carting away the last oblomki imperi, the final props from a life that no longer existed. The finality was absolute. The pressure to vacate wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. The last, most fundamental title to be stripped away was not prince or duke. It was Pa's family. But family for Andrew was always a hierarchy. He was born into the role of the spare, a life defined by proximity to the throne, but never the throne itself. This created a hunger, a need for a separate legacy away from the shadow of his elder brother. The Falklands War provided the script. He was the helicopter pilot, the dashing hero, Randy Andy, the tabloid prince. For a moment his glory was his own smelling of salt water and cordite. It was a potent drug. The public adoration, the sense of purpose. It carved out an appetite for a life less ordinary, a life beyond the rigid confines of royal duty. The same bravado that earned him medals would later become the very architecture of his downfall. The hero's narrative was just the first act, the prologue to an pause iskalečené судьба. The war hero needed a new war. The trade envoy needed new markets, not for Britain, but for himself. The entry point was not a man, but a woman, Ghislaine Maxwell. The daughter of a fallen tycoon, she was a socialite with a compass that pointed exclusively toward power and money. She was the bridge from the stale air of the palace to the electric hum of American wealth, and she led him directly to Pa's Jeffrey Epstein. It began in the late 90s, a world of private jets, sprawling ranches, and an island that existed outside the laws of men. To Andrew, Epstein wasn't a predator. He was a resource, a financier with a black book that opened doors the crown could not. He saw a network of influence. He failed to see the web. This was the fateful mistake. The handshake that sealed a pact written in invisible ink, the terms of which would only become clear 2 decades later, under the cold light of a courtroom. The first tremor arrived in 2015. A lawsuit in Florida that did not name him, but described a prince. The palace deployed its most potent weapon. Pause. Silence. A brief cold denial was issued, and the file was buried deep in the institutional memory, filed under unpleasantness. The problem, it seemed, was solved. But it wasn't solved. It was fermenting. Then came July 2019. Jeffrey Epstein's arrest was not just news. It was an earthquake that cracked the foundations of palaces and penthouses alike. The whispers from 2015 returned as a roar. The old denials, once a shield of granite, were now just paper in a hurricane. Each photograph, each remembered party, was re-examined, relitigated on the front pages. Andrew's strategy was to project normalcy. He attended royal functions. He smiled for the cameras. He believed the old rules still applied. A fatal miscalculation. The world had changed, but he had not. The pressure was no longer a distant rumble. It was the sound of the ground crumbling beneath his feet. The story was now a runaway train, and he was tied to the tracks. The threat was no longer a ghost in a legal filing. It was a formal complaint, filed in a New York court. It now had a name and a number. This was the inventory of sins. The civil lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre was not a negotiation. It was a public autopsy. The defense constructed a bizarre fortress of denial, a trip to a provincial pizza restaurant, and alleged medical inability to perspire. These were not legal arguments. They were pleas from a man drowning in absurdity, each claim a desperate grasp for a piece of driftwood in a sea of evidence. On the other side of the ledger, the facts were cold and hard. There was the photograph, a frozen moment in a Mayfair townhouse, a tableau of privilege and predation. His arm, proprietary. Her smile, a mask. Then the flight logs from Epstein's jet, a cold digital record of ascents and descents into a moral abyss. Pause. Andrew's name printed again and again, a recurring character in a grim fairy tale. The final act was not a courtroom battle. It was a transaction, a settlement, the exact figure sealed, but the meaning brutally clear. Millions of dollars to purchase silence, to avoid the humiliation of a public deposition. This was the ultimate price of his association with Epstein. Not a prison sentence, but a gilded cage. He had not been found guilty by a jury. He had simply signed the invoice for his own public execution. But a public execution is not an ending, it is a spectacle. And while the money was meant to purchase a tombstone, the digital archive is a necropolis that never sleeps. The document release of early 2026 was not an investigation. It was an exhumation. 3 million files, a blizzard of data bearing the last remnants of plausible deniability. The photograph was the centerpiece, not the old one in the Mayfair townhouse, a new triptych of images. Andrew, barefoot, on all fours over a woman on the floor. It is not an image of indiscretion, it is an anatomy of power, a grotesque tableau of royal absurdity. The smile is the most damning detail. Then, the correspondence. The claim of severed ties in 2010 was a carefully constructed lie, and the emails were the receipts for its purchase. The message sent after the Giuffre photo became public was a pact. Pause. We are in this together. Not a question. A statement of fact. A bond forged in mutual risk. The offer of lots of privacy at Buckingham Palace was the final desecration. It converted a symbol of national heritage into a private venue for a convicted predator. This new evidence did not change the story. It simply stripped away the last layers of gauze from the wound, revealing the rot underneath. The verdict was already known. This was merely the coroner's detailed report on the cause of Paul's moral death. Proximity to the throne was supposed to be his shield. Instead, it became his fatal vulnerability. His entire life, Paul's, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, traded on a currency he did not earn, his name. This made him not a predator, but a prize, a magnificent specimen for men like Epstein, who collected power, influence, and access. The royal status was not a fortress, it was a magnet for parasites. Every indiscretion, which for a lesser man would be a private shame, was amplified by the echo chamber of his birthright. His fall was not quiet. It was seismic, shaking the very foundations of the institution that bred him. The armor of royalty turned out to be made of glass. It glittered, it impressed, but the first stone shattered it, exposing the hollow man inside. The eviction from Royal Lodge is the physical manifestation of this verdict. A 30-room mansion exchanged for a farmhouse on the Sandringham estate. It is not a relocation. It is an internal exile, a downgrading of a man to a problem. The credible whispers of a move to Bahrain are the logical next step, an attempt to outrun the geography of his own disgrace. But the scandal is not in the British press. It is in the historical record. His closeness to power was a fatal miscalculation. The crown did not provide cover. It was a spotlight, and it illuminated not a prince, but a long dark shadow of Paul's irreversible disgrace. The eviction notice was not paper. It was a judgment rendered in stone. The 30 rooms of Royal Lodge, once a stage for a prince, became a mausoleum for a man who was already a ghost. Here lies the anatomy of his new existence. Loneliness, distilled and pure, served in crystal glasses on tables set for one. The silence in those gilded halls was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from unspoken accusations and dead phone lines. He had transitioned from a life of glorious poverty, a prince always short of cash, to something far worse. Pause. Absolute ruin, not of the bank account, but of the soul. His reputation was not merely tarnished, it was incinerated. The ash of it clings to his family, a permanent smudge on the crown's polished surface. Each day is an inventory of loss. Each night, a confrontation with the man in the mirror who cost him everything. This is the final entry in the ledger, the posthumous audit of a life still being lived. His future is not a path. It is a monument to shame, a crippled destiny that will serve as a footnote in the history of the House of Windsor, a dark testament to the fact that blood is not a shield. It is merely a conductor for disgrace. The man who once represented his country in trade now represents a single cautionary tale, a lesson written in the cold ink of court documents and the grainy pixels of damning photographs. His legacy is not in children or deeds. It is a permanent stain, a structural weakness in a 1,000-year-old fortress. What remains is not a prince or a duke or even a man. It is a problem boxed up and moved to a remote farmhouse, an exile in his own kingdom. The final verdict is not punishment. It is Paul's irrelevance. The file is closed.